Hello, everybody!
Turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Turning it up. Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome back to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, and not just any fantasy today. Because today we are discussing a book that I've been looking forward to ever since we started the podcast. This has been a book that has been on my TBR shortlist for well over a year, even longer, I guess a couple of years now. And
is that still a short list then? If it takes you over a year to get to it?
Yes, it is a short list, but you know, it depends. It's all relative. But I've been saving it to read for the show and get to talk about it on the air. And that day has finally come today. I'm, of course, referring to the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin, book 1 of the Broken Earth series.
Yeah, this one has quickly become a classic of modern fantasy.
For sure.
It's the winner of 3 consecutive Hugo Awards, and it's a truly phenomenal book. We'll get into all the accolades. I know you have a whole list of them. We could probably go through all the accolades and spend an hour doing that, but we'll give you the
I had to get a
highlights
highlights of N.K. Jemisin's accomplishments and achievements, because to go through the full list would take up the whole podcast. There's so much to talk about with her career.
Did I say 3 that this book won 3
you
consecutive?
Did, but we all know what
series,
you meant, that the
series,
series
Broken
did.
Earth trilogy won 3
yes.
consecutive. This one only won 1 Best Novel Hugo Award, because each book is only capable of winning one of those.
Yes,
it would be even more impressive maybe if this book just won it.
Exactly. Just one. It's just like, you know what, give it to 5th season again. That was a good one. That was a classic. Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. And you know, we've been talking about this book for a long time. It gets recommended a lot. Every time I'm in a bookstore, even when the fantasy section is measly and thin, 5th season is always proudly on display. And I've always wanted to figure out why. I mean, everyone sweeps the Hugos. N.K. Jemisin, celebrated author. This book is everywhere on everyone's book club list. Kind of transcended the genre a little bit and got some mass appeal. And I've just been super excited to experience for myself why this book is so celebrated. And I'm super excited to get into that discussion today, because there's a lot of really fascinating things going on in this book that I cannot wait to get into. Before we do that, though, as Dylan had mentioned, there was some information about N.K. Jemisin that I want to get into very quickly, just because I find her to be a super fascinating individual. She attended Tulane University, which is where I also attended, so we have some common ground there. And she received, it was a bachelor's in psychology, which kind of mirrors a little bit of you, Dylan, right?
Well, yeah, she has a lot of background that mirrors mine in some ways. She went on to study counseling, earned her master's in education from the University of Maryland, and I'm getting my PhD in counseling psychology right now. She ended up working in the counseling psychology field, and she was a career counselor, which I've also been a career counselor at times. So, yeah, then she went into writing full-time after that, and I think it's really awesome to be covering someone who has this psychology background. It totally shows in her character writing. The characters are so complex and interesting and well-rounded too. There's so much depth and stuff going on.
Yeah, what is it about psychology majors that make such good fantasy authors? Our friend Joe Abercrombie is a psychology background as well. I guess that deep understanding of characterization is what helps them succeed, and being able to get into the minds of their characters.
For sure. And that definitely shows with both of those awesome authors and psychology graduates.
For sure. And what's interesting about Jemisin is, she was writing for the New York Times. She submitted stuff, but I think she had a bi-weekly column in the New York Times, and she mounted a Patreon campaign, according to her bio, which helped her pursue writing full time. And then her novel, The Fifth Season, was published in 2015, and it won the Hugo Award for Best Novel. What's interesting about this, though, is it makes Jemisin the first Black author to win a Hugo Award. And I had to, in that category, in the Best Novel category. And I had to do a double take on that. I was like, is that really true? And sure enough, it's true. But the accolades don't end there, because the other books in the trilogy, The Obelisk Gate and The Stone Sky, also won the Hugo Award for Best Novels in 2017 and 2018, respectively, which makes Jemisin the first author of all time to win the Hugo Award for the best novel in 3 consecutive years, as well as the first to win for all 3 novels in a trilogy. She swept the Hugos.
Yeah. And I've read the whole series, so I can tell you that all of those are extremely well deserved. This is one of those rare series. We're only going to cover the 5th season in this episode, so you don't have to worry about spoilers beyond that. Mm-hmm. But this is a rare series that keeps up the quality throughout, and I don't know. It's one of those where I'm not even sure which one is my favorite book. It might even be the last one of the 3. So it's I think there's a lot of series that start off strong and then they start to wane once you get past that original concept. Mm-hmm. This one is extremely impressive throughout, and I'm just so happy that we're finally getting to discuss this on the podcast. I've been chomping at the bit for a while now.
I know, this is an exciting moment for me too, and I have so much to say, but before we get into all of these delicious spoilers, Dylan, let's go ahead and give one of your famous spoiler warnings. Just before you do, all I'm going to say is, if you haven't read the book, check it out. If you're a fantasy fan and you haven't read this, put it on your TBR list. Read it as soon as you can, because it is worth it. It's very, very good.
Yeah, if the 3 consecutive Hugos wasn't enough to get you to start this series, you now have Charles and me telling you to start it. So.
Well said.
All right, yes. The spoiler warning is that we're going to be getting into the 5th season with no holds barred. Mm-hmm. So that means if you haven't yet read this book, it's a good time to turn this down in your headphones and come back to us when you've finished the book. We will not be getting into any spoilers beyond the 5th season in this series, especially because Charles hasn't read those books, so you can trust me that I won't go past this one. But yeah, let's get into it, Charles. No further ado.
Let's get into it. The 5th season. To me, what kicked off this whole, it starts very strong. It's got a very famous opening line. Dylan, what do you think? Should we just go ahead and start with the opening line?
Let's start with the end of the world, why don't we? That's how it starts. So, first line, let's start with the end of the world, why don't we? Get it over with and move on to more interesting things. So, absolutely love this quote. It grabs you so quick because, how many fantasy novels have we read, Charles, where what is on the line is the end of the world, right? That's, right. I feel like, the most typical stakes of an epic fantasy novel.
Right.
And here we really early on get Jemisin doing what she does really well, which is take the genre in a very different direction and subvert some expectations that we have with a fantasy book like this. So she begins with the end of the world instead of having it be something that hangs over our heads. for the whole series, and she's
I love the phrasing.
Let's just get that part out of the way.
I love the phrasing "get it out of the way" because sometimes it's true. You're trying to fit to these archetypes of a story, and it's like, let's just the world ends. Let's acknowledge that, and let's get into what's happening with these characters right now. And there's so much about this is not the shy year where it's all happy and then the dangers looming off in the horizon, right? And the Dark Lord's growing in power and you have to face him and face that big battle. This is totally different. This is the world ends and let's move on. The setting is, of course, the supercontinent called the Stillness, and every few centuries there's a fifth season, which is basically a calamity, a natural disaster that kind of wipes humanity out. It's this kind of end of the world phrasing, but then I think there's also hints that there's a really bad one coming this time around, right? So that's the setting that we're in.
Yeah, and it's a rare series that gets me really enthralled by the world building, but this is one of those series. I'm a huge character guy, and obviously there's tons in this book that you can love,
but also not as many as you think.
Right. Yes. I mean, we'll get into that, which is one of my favorite twists in the fantasy genre ever, which is the point of view, like where they all end up being the same person. We'll get into that in more detail, but yes, there are less characters than you might think. You might think of this as a multiple point of view book, but it's up for debate whether or not that's true. But anyway, we start with this idea of this continent called the Stillness, which feels ironically named because of the massive natural disasters that involve like earthquakes and anything but still that happen in the Stillness. Exactly. So, and pretty early on, we get we learn by the end of the book that it's Hoa, the Stone Eater, that's narrating this book. But we get him kind of going into some of what the Stillness is like, and we also get him kind of breaking down some of the structures of it. It's really interesting. It almost has that like a campfire storytelling feel to the start of it before we really dive into Essun as a character.
Well said. And the world building goes just beyond the setting. You have a kind of, I think it's a very unique magic system with the Orogenies. The name of the system, Origins. Oh, that's right. You were listening to the audiobook, so you've got the pronunciations for me.
Yeah.
Orogenies. I see.
You pronounce that in your head as Orogenies the whole time?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just pronouncing it phonetically.
Glass shattering moment.
I appreciate that.
That's all right. There's an Italian restaurant near me called Oregano's. And I was looking up on Yelp. I was looking up like places to go, and I was like, "Ooh, 4 stars for Oreganos," and I was so embarrassed I wanted to die. So, yes.
And now you've shared it with everyone.
Yes. Now all the people listening here know about my huge mistake. But Charles, I did that to join you. I used my psychology background here to show empathy. And
we appreciate that.
We'll move past this now and we'll call them Origins.
Origins. And what's very unique about the Origins is that on one hand, they wield a tremendous amount of power, being able to control the shakes of the earth and the energy of the earth. And I forget the name of what they call the science of their magic system. It's not seismology, but it's a play on that word that I'm currently forgetting. But it's this idea that they can quell shakes in the earth or cause shakes in the earth. And it makes them incredibly powerful, but it also makes them a subclass in society. The people that be, the powers that be, are trying to control them. And the way they say it is, if you're untrained, you could potentially wipe out a whole city or a whole continent. So we need to train you and put you in school and keep you controlled this whole time. And it's that unique balance that helps solidify one of the main themes of this book, which is oppression. And I think the idea of having a class of, of ethnicity or a kind of person that is so powerful yet also so oppressed has an interesting duology to it that permeates through the whole book.
Yeah. So the fact that they are so powerful is why they're oppressed, which is an interesting theme throughout this. And we have people who are tasked with keeping the origins under control, the guardians, who are, we also find out are children of origins. And we also find out that the origins themselves are not considered human, even though they obviously are human.
Right.
And it's a really interesting way that she goes about that, where the reason they're not considered human is traced back to some like decree that was made by a council of sorts. I know it's the kind of thing, it reminds you of parallels to things like the 3/5 compromise here in the United States, that it just legally call people who are obviously human, not in that case, not fully human, but also in the case of the 5th season, not human at all. And it's such an interesting, I guess, parallel that she's able to do throughout this novel. Is this book has a lot of implications for the real world, but it can also work extremely well as a fantasy novel. And those are some of the best books out there.
That's well said. And that is that is explained right away when we kick off with Esun's story. I'm pronouncing that correctly, Dylan?
Yeah.
Esun.
Esun. I think it's...
That's close.
Yeah.
So Esun is a middle-aged woman with 2 young children. And it starts with one of the children she discovers was beaten to death by her husband when the husband found out that this child was an orogeny. An origin. Dang, I gotta get that in my mind. Is an origin. And that kicks off. It just be the fact that this child exists and is capable of doing this. You could do something so horrible as kill your own child, which is an interesting parallel to what happens later in the book, by the way. Just gonna say the fact that this killing of children, but Esun, it's right off the bat. And what's also interesting about her is her POV, of the narration of her character.
You're talking about the second person narration, I assume, that this starts with the literally using you. The only other time I can think of that I've read a book that used you was, we're going back to the Goosebumps Choose Your Own Adventure books.
Oh, okay.
You ever read those?
Yeah. I was like, what book was he reading that was second person? I was like, oh, Choose Your Own Adventure. Yeah. I see.
Right. When we were kids, we'd go to those little, what do they call those? Like book fairs that they would have at elementary school.
Scholastic book fairs.
Books I would always get. Yeah, Scholastic book fairs. I'm sure a lot of people in the U.S. anyway can relate to those, nostalgic for us book readers. So I would always grab those Goosebumps Choose Your Own Adventure books, and they were the ones that were like, you walk into this scary carnival and all this stuff's going on, and if you want to go on the merry-go-round, then go to page whatever, and if you don't, then go to this other page. But other than that, I've never read anything in second person point of view, but it works so well in this book. And the way that I always think about it, at least with my psychology influence here, is that right away we're dealing with trauma from Esun, right? I mean, what could be more traumatic than coming home to find your child dead and killed by your husband? And
such a violent, horrific way.
Yeah. And she is just feeling depersonalized and disassociated. And there's something about that that makes it feel like it's almost like you're floating above yourself looking down and seeing you do all of these things that aren't even under your own control. And that's exactly how Esun is feeling right off the bat. She's like not even aware of herself. It's like that looking down on yourself, depersonalized feeling. So it's a risk that N.K. Jemisin took,
Huge.
especially it's her first, first book in the series, and it's, I don't know, it's amazing that she pulled it off.
And she sticks with it the whole book, too. I don't know how difficult it must have been to keep up writing like that and to keeping track of, like, all the different grammatical things involved with writing in second person. Like, reading it was just like an exercise of my brain, where it's like a muscle you don't normally use. It's like, oh, this. And it also compounds her skills as an author, because yes, the detachment is huge when you read things like you look over your beaten child, who's just died. Like, that's intense. But then there's also moments where it's like, you are a middle-aged woman, you had 2 kids, and as the person reading that, I'm not a middle-aged woman, I do not have kids, all of those things. This is a book that has to deal with oppression, and a part of that is kind of like we're all human at the end of the day. Empathizing, right. And what better way to empathize with the character than to make you, the reader, the character? And it's like, you are doing this, you're doing that, you're thinking about it, and when you read the reading experience, when you go through something like that, it actually does invoke some kind of empathy. It switches the way your mind is processing the story, and it was a really entertaining read. Like you said, Dylan, there's no other books that I've read that is in second person besides the Choose Your Own Adventure Goosebumps novels. So this was a really interesting experience, and it can come off as gimmicky so easily, but Jemisin nails it and bakes it into her characters and into her themes, and that's why I think it's such a brilliant use, and why it's deserving of a Hugo for sure.
Definitely a huge part of why it's deserving of a Hugo, and that's well said, Charles. I've never really thought about it through that lens of how it helps you produce empathy, that you're getting the second person, you do this, you do that. But it definitely, now that I'm thinking about it, it definitely works to do that. Good on you, Charles.
Thank you. Well, you got the detachment part, and that's why we make such a great pair.
Well, that's nice.
If I do say so myself.
Here, welcome to the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast, where we congratulate ourselves on being a great duo. We're just such good podcast hosts.
I know, worthy of 5 stars on Spotify.
Yes, or Apple Podcasts if you have been using Apple Podcasts. Yeah. All right. Well, let's get back to this. So we're greeted with Esun. We right away see that she has been hiding her identity. She's married to this guy who just killed her son. And also what's interesting is he's never shown any history of violence. She mentions that, where she's like, oh, if only there was some warning about this, it might be like something I could have dealt with. But he's not a typically violent person. So you get this sense that if he was willing to go from like a guy who never hit his kids, never hit his wife or anything like that, to all of a sudden beating their son to death, then that is how serious this anti-origin sentiment goes.
And compound that with this, like, it was because her child was an origin and she is an origin. So there's the guilt that comes with that as well. It's like you knowingly had kids that had a 50% shot of being origin. I think it is how it works out, if I remember correctly. And you can't help but feel some guilt on that, even though it's totally not your fault. It's like, of course your child is going to be like you, but because it's so rooted in the society that they're dangerous or subhuman or something like that, that the husband goes out of character to do something as horrible as kill his own child is a strong way to start the story, for sure. Quite the statement.
Right. And the only thing that really keeps Esun going at all here is the fact that she can't find her daughter, and she assumes and later figures out that he left, the husband left with their daughter still alive. And her daughter's also an origin. So she's really trying to find her and get her out of the clutches of the same man who is willing to kill their son.
For sure. But before she does, she, in her anger or her rage, as to quote Star Wars, she like causes a massive earthquake in her village, in her town, and she, not only is she set out to, rescue her daughter, she's also kind of fleeing her town, in fear of being discovered.
And the
as an
earthquake
origin.
Destroys the water supply.
Yes,
is a key part of that. So basically, and the way it's written is so well done. I don't have it in front of me right now, but it's along the lines of like, in that moment, you doomed the entire town. It's like very simply written. Like, it's like, and that's the thing throughout this book. Esun, how many people does Esun kill? It's like, but you still root for her,
right?
Which is pretty amazing. And I think that's
yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you finish.
Oh, well, I just think it's a testament to how N.K. Jemisin builds that empathy for character. It's like, it doesn't even feel like she's overly morally gray or that anyone would read this and not root for her.
Right.
Which is shocking considering how many things she does that result in the death of lots of people, but just always feels justified. I know it's never justified to kill people, but it feels that way when you're reading the book from her perspective.
Right.
Or from
she
the
didn't
second person perspective.
She didn't intentionally shut off the water supply to the town. She was acting out, enraged that one of her children was killed and the other one was abducted. And what's interesting, it's like a cyclical thing, and this is the nuanced complexity of oppression, right? Because people are afraid of orogeny because of the potential disasters they can cause. She caused the disaster through being an origin, but she only did that because someone killed her kid because they were origin. So it's like this really complex cycle.
Cyclical.
Yeah, it's very cyclical. And this is just in the first like 2 chapters, right? So already there's so much happening here about I'm sure the townspeople are like, wow, origins are really dangerous. It's a good thing that when we find them, we either kill them as kids or send them off to a school where they're treated as subhuman. Otherwise, they'd be leveling cities all over the place. But really what triggered it was, an act of basically, I guess you could call it some kind of oppression, racism towards an origin child. And the mother was in grief. It was not an intentional act I'm going to cut off this town's water supply. It was, they made it a point to say, through grief and through rage, that she did that. So very good character work, very good theme development right off the bat.
It also should be noted that in the prologue they mentioned that there's this giant earthquake approaching the town, and Esun actually stops that earthquake from hitting the town before she dooms the town.
Right.
So it's almost this zero-sum thing that plays out.
This like thankless
she stops her.
thing,
Yeah. And that's what's really interesting in part about orogeny is that it allows the Origin's power to actually save people. Right. And that's a huge part of what they do in the Fulcrum, which is like the... I guess I was going to call it a magical academy, but that makes it sound way too nice. Like it makes you think of things like the university and the King Killer Chronicle or something, or Hogwarts, which seem like fun places to be. Right. It's like evil Hogwarts.
It's like it's basically like almost like a prison school.
Yeah. But there are elements that feel very much like a normal school, but there's this just awful, insidious, I guess, hegemony that's going on.
Yeah, and they have no rights, and they're being trained to do a very specific jobs, and they put in breeding programs and this, that, and the other. So,
right. But anyway, point being, the Fulcrum is trying to train them, at least in theory, to help people and save people, and they send them out even on when they get older on these like missions where they get hired to help out towns and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So obviously there's an awareness within the society of the ways in which origins can be helpful, mm-hmm. but the fear creates the fear and the for lack of a better word, racism that plays out here is producing a cycle, like you said, Charles, mm-hmm. where they're not able to be those kind of people, especially when they're outside of the Fulcrum, and any reasonable person would rebel against the Fulcrum mm-hmm. for the things that the Fulcrum does to them. Right. So it's just, there's no way for them to be what they can be in the society, which is like, they could be like superheroes.
They could. But what's interesting is when an origin is doing a good job, no one can tell, because just life is normal, la-di-da. It's like, I just quelled an earthquake, but no one can like experience a quelled earthquake and be like, nice job, they're doing so much good for us. Because like, well, nothing happens, and then all of a sudden they level a city and cut off our water supply, you know? So it's like the good deeds don't go noticed, and then the bad deeds can be disastrous. So that's kind of another interesting part of the magic system. Something I also was realizing is how a lot of the babies that we do see in younger people quell earthquakes naturally. It makes me wonder how much of this, like, you have to go to the Fulcrum and get trained or die, is really like a accepted belief, or is it something used by the Fulcrum to oppress origins, you know? Because these babies were quelling. I mean, they were very talented kids, the ones that we know for a fact are doing that, but they were still able to naturally quell shakes without knowing anything. So who knows how much they need to go to school to learn that.
Right. We've run into a society where there are the word that they use are, I think, feral, is that's the Fulcrum.
Right.
I'm making air quotes over here. But there are people who are untrained origins, and they have this whole society where they are able to do things like stopping earthquakes, but they don't have the level of precision or skills as people like Alabaster and Essun, then called Cyanite, mm-hmm. are able to show. And there's a character, Inin, who, you know, she ends up in this polyamorous relationship with, mm-hmm. and he has some line along the lines of, I almost wish I went to this Fulcrum so I could see why you all come out so like pissed off, but also so talented.
Yeah.
So
I do remember that
this ability. Yeah, I wish I had that in front of me to actually not butcher the quote. But point being, yes, there is a degree to which just naturally they're able to exhibit these skills, but the Fulcrum, as evil as it is, does teach them how to do things that they would never have learned otherwise. Mm-hmm. That being said, theoretically, there could be a Fulcrum that is more like regular Hogwarts and not like evil Hogwarts, where they still learn these skills, but it's not a horrible experience for them.
Well said. And that kind of segues nicely into talking about Demaya, because Demaya is a child that is discovered to be an origin and is then taken to the Fulcrum later in life, right? They're a young girl, but they're on that cusp of like, you probably should be killed because you've been left to your own devices for too long. But, you know, I'm your guardian. You just have to do what I say, but I can protect you. And the dynamic between Demaya and, I'm going to call him Shafa.
Yeah, nailed it.
Is one of my favorites in the whole book. These sections are fascinating.
Yeah, this book, I knew this was going to be a book that I really appreciated during that moment where Shafa is trying to teach Demaya this lesson by breaking her hand for basically no reason, just to elicit obedience. And it's this horrifying moment.
Oh, yeah.
And it's shocking. But it's so intriguing and different because leading up to that moment, Shafa actually seemed like a pretty nice guy.
Oh, yeah.
And then it just out of nowhere, he just breaks her hand. And it's like all of these typical tropes that we see through typical fantasy novels get subverted so well in this book. And Shafa seems like he's going to be this, I don't think quite Gandalf type guy, but he is this guy that kind of comes in with that mentor mentality, it seems, and is going to go take her off on something of an adventure. And he's being nice, and he's really giving it to her parents who have been really crappy parents. And she's appreciating that. He's being nice to her. And then all of a sudden it's like, this isn't Gandalf.
Right.
This is not your typical mentor. This is a guy who will break her hand for essentially no reason but eliciting obedience.
Right. I mean, he uses it to say, like, you need to be in control even under great duress, and all of this is, I think, part of it. But it was totally unnecessary in that moment. I just think that she was starting to challenge him, and he nipped it in the bud with an over severe punishment.
I think it's apparently standard practice that on their way to the fulcrum, their hands just get broken. Because I don't think that's explicitly said at any point, but she does mention
there was another guardian that does a similar thing to her, or tries to, in the fulcrum. Remember when she's sneaking around in the caves? And there was that guardian.
That was a different thing, because that guardian was like possessed.
Yeah, but they were doing the same thing, breaking her hand.
Sure. I think, though, the part that I noted was when she's thinking about what Imin, that character I mentioned earlier, who's the quote-unquote feral origin, she's thinking about what would he be like if he had actually been in the fulcrum. And she was like, oh, it'd be so terrible because he's this huge charismatic personality. And they're like, and he'd have had his hand broken, and then he would have probably been way more muted as a personality, and it'd be so sad. So I think it's just standard practice. I don't think that he did it for any reason, but this is what you do to make them obedient. And it's a word I'm using over and over again, but yeah.
And that's well said. What I also think is interesting in these early moments between Demaya and Shafa is I don't think Shafa is necessarily deceitful or even necessarily dislikes Demaya. I think he actually, in his own way, does feel a sense of responsibility and love towards Demaya, and that comes down to, again, to this idea of oppression. It's so firmly rooted in this society that Shafa can still say, I love you, I care about you, do these things for me, I always have your best interest in heart, and then break her hand and treat her differently than other people in the same breath. Like, I don't think he's being deceitful. I don't think he is trying to beat her down necessarily, but he does say, never say no to me. I'm trying to protect you. And then Demaya's like, he's the only one paying attention to me. I love him. And it's that relationship dynamic that's so complex, and there's no, like, it's hard to say there's no evil person when Shafa's breaking her hand, but he's doing what he does to every origin who needs to be able to control their powers. Like, it's this firmly rooted systematic thing. So I think Shafa can break her hand and also still care about her in the same breath from the society that N.K. Jemisin has built. And that is what what hooked me into that scene, that moment so deeply. It was like, wow, this is a complex relationship that you do not normally get in fantasy, and a hard thing to pull off when you're trying to talk about oppression without having someone just being an absolute evil person and thinking of the person they're oppressing as a thing. Where this, like in this case, Shafa actually sees Demaya and has a relationship, like a kind of like a parent-like relationship with her. It's a bit more nuanced, and I love that.
Great point, Charles. I totally agree that Shafa, in his own way, at least thinks he has love for Demaya, definitely feels an obligation to look out for her in the way that he thinks is incumbent upon him as a guardian.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the guardians have more privilege than do the origins in this, but they're part of this weird system of oppression as well.
Mm-hmm.
And they're stuck in
they have chips in their
role
brains
in all of this. Yeah. So you do get that sense where there's that scene that we referenced earlier when there's a guardian that just starts saying all these weird things to Demaya after they find her and this other character that will later be called Tonki, but I can't remember what her name was at that time. But they were sneaking around the fulcrum and they entered this area that you're not supposed to. And then that guardian just starts saying those weird things. She's grabbing really hard.
Banoff leadership,
What's
Humanist, Tonki's forename, Binof.
Yeah. Dinoff, okay. So, anyway, the guardian starts grabbing Demaya's arm and saying all of these really weird things. And then Shafa comes in and just tears something out of the neck, right?
Mm-hmm. Right, it's like by the spinal cord there, yeah.
Yeah, and he's like, "Oh, that's a shame. Bummer that happened."
And another one walks in and like, "Oh man."
Yeah, exactly. So,
and that's an interesting moment because then he says, "You
guardian.
have to pass for me." Like he wants Demaya to live and survive, and he goes, "I'm going to put you through something tough again, but you have to pass so that you can stay useful and alive." So in a sense, he's looking out for her again, even though he's committing horrible acts of violence and to even other guardians. So yeah, it's a complex relationship. He's a complex character. One of my favorites, not because I think he's great personality-wise, but because he's very compelling, thank you, and the way he is written and the relationship that he has with Demaya is one of my favorite parts, if not my favorite part about this book. It's just a fascinating take on the mentor-found family relationship.
For sure, Charles. When I first read this book, and I didn't know the twist, I considered Demaya to be my favorite character, and I was most intrigued by that storyline to start with. And hopefully that segs us into when she's about to take that first ring
And that's
test.
so funny, because I remember being at this point, I'm like, how did these characters ever converge? I was like, at some point they got to come together, right? Like, that was my brain.
Oh, they come together.
And I was like, oh, that's how they come together.
Right. So the twist totally got me as well, Charles.
Yeah.
I did not see it coming because we're so used to these multiple point of view fantasy books. We don't even question it.
And she does it twice, by the way. So it happens once, and I'm like, oh, Demaya and Cyanide are the same person. Brilliant. I wonder how Asun comes into it. And it's like, oh,
I think I figured it out at that point.
I didn't. She got me twice with the same gag.
She got you twice.
Yeah.
Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
Shame
that
on
one's
me
on
for
you
not
now,
getting
Charles.
the Asun one, but the Demaya one was good.
Yeah. So I love that Demaya storyline. And then, what happens is right at that first ring test, she's allowed to choose her name. And what does she say? But Cyanide, which we know is this other character that we should probably get into now.
Well said. Let's talk about Cyanide. She is a 4-ringer origin.
Yes.
So she's she's ambitious as well, I would say, and she's very powerful. And she's, I'm going to say, partnered with, assigned to Alabaster, who is a 10-ringer, which is like a big deal.
He's the only one.
He's the only one. Super powerful origin. And they're part of this breeding program, I guess. And there's breeders in this society where they're trying to control the production of origin, essentially. And that is how the cyanide alabaster relationship is first formed, first started.
Right. And Alabaster, who we find out later is not even attracted to women, he is assigned all of these breeders to him who he's supposed to just reproduce with because he is a 10 ringer and he has these impressive genes that they just want to spread those around. So he's already had a bunch of kids who just immediately get taken away from him. It's actually extremely sad.
It is sad. And as we, like, my favorite part of the cyanide chapters is kind of learning more, like watching the Alabaster character develop and watching their relationship develop. Because to me, what I like most about Alabaster is watching how he uses his power to fight like oppression, essentially, in the ways that he can. And it's interesting how he starts to bring up those discussions to Cyanide and challenge Cyanide's firmly rooted beliefs that she developed from being raised in the Fulcrum, right? It's programmed basically to believe a certain way, that she is a certain subclass. And Alabaster, all he's doing is showing her node stations, which are these horrific places where they just lobotomize children so that they just become like batteries, basically these node quelling organic powered vegetables, unfortunately. And it starts to wake her up, and just through his own confidence and his willingness to push back against what society and the Fulcrum are teaching and challenge it just in his own beliefs, is one of the more powerful things I've ever seen from a character. And not just like facing a Balrog and killing him and coming back. It's like this power of like, I refuse to believe that. I refuse it, even though even though it's what all of society says. Like, I am going to explore this, knowing what I know about Origin and what I can do. I'm going to explore these node stations. I'm going to push the boundaries of discovery and acceptance and belief of what Origins can do. And I'm going to challenge, do I know that because it's true or because I was told to believe it? And he's constantly having those conversations and pushing and pushing. And it's a slow burn that I'm just like, that really drives these chapters for me.
Well said, Charles. Yeah, Alabaster is such a great character. He's in this situation where he's the only 10 ringer. They kind of leave him to his own devices for the most part, which is why he's able to figure all this stuff out on his own and really start to question things. And he's basically taking Cyanide around and exposing her to all of these hard truths until she starts to see things much more the way that Alabaster does. I mean, before Alabaster starts taking her around, her ambitions that you mentioned, Charles, are basically to move up in the Fulcrum. So she's still playing the game here. She's still involved in the system, and she just wants to move up within the system. And we know that Alabaster wants to break the system.
Right.
We especially learn that at the end of the book, where Alabaster is like, yeah, I caused this season, and I want you to help. Help destroy it, not help solve it. He's like, so he's a break the wheel kind of guy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Break the wheel for sure. And it's interesting in relationship that develops, because they start to form a partnership and form a relationship, which is interesting. Because at first it starts out where it's like, oh, they're forced to be together, and then they'll go and like realize they loved each other all along, and it doesn't go there. It kind of settles into this like platonic but still intimate compromise relationship where they raise a family together and enter this polyamorous relationship where they can find love and compassion and coexist together. And Alabaster even says like, this is all I need in life. This is it, to like have a happy family and relationships and live a simple life. Like, this is everything. And to watch them get to that point where it's not like I love you with all my heart. Let's be together forever. It's this more of like, life is good right now. Like, this is it. Like, let's celebrate that. It is the kind of happy ending that I enjoy because it's more firmly rooted in reality, I'd say. And it's not the romantic, grandiose culmination ending, but it is a really different, unique, modern way to end a relationship. But of course, the last couple chapters get
right. We do not get that happy ending.
Right.
We more get a happy middle.
Right. It was a happy medium, 3/4. Yeah. Happy medium.
Yeah. And it all for the cyanide chapters after she ends up on that island and she's in that polyamorous relationship with Inin and Alabaster. They have this kid who's like a would-be prodigy of orogeny, and then the crap hits the fan when these ships show up with guardians and freaking cannons, which are a high level of technology for the world that we're dealing with here, and it's just calamity. It is guardians just like killing. I think Inin gets killed by a guardian right in front of Cyanide.
Yeah. All of her, like almost family. I remember there was like someone that they described getting like gutted basically, and this whole village is getting raided by guardians.
And even Alabaster, he puts up a great fight, but he just runs out of energy, for lack of a better way of describing what he's doing. And a Stone Eater who's just like feasting on him ends up taking him away. He's got no arms and legs, I think, at this point. And Cyanide just has to watch him go.
But he's like going slowly and is like, save the child. Like very dramatic.
Well, he's like, don't let them get the child, right. Is the way that
because again, we have to remember the node stations, and Alabaster does not want that for another one of his children, the one he got to raise with his family. So
exactly, yeah. It should be mentioned, if we didn't already, that the one at the horrifying node station scene was Alabaster's child. It's not confirmed, but the way that
it's implied that many of them are, because he's that's the reason they're using him as the the subject of breeding, because he is so powerful and his children can naturally quell shakes, that they want him to have as many babies as possible so they can basically make them brain dead, comatose, and just hook them up to machines and let them just by instinct quell nodes. It's like the perfect kind of subservient human, the kind you can just automate and just to serve one function and not have to worry about the rest of their humanity.
Yeah. And what ends up happening then is Cyanide draws from the power of an obelisk, which we haven't really mentioned the obelisks, but they play a big role. They're basically these floating things that we learn that for some reason Origins can draw power from, or anyway, really powerful Origins can draw power from. It's only confirmed here that Cyanide, I think Alabaster can do it too. So she ends up using that power to just destroy like everything around her, including the ship that they're on, and then she does kill Guardians during that, which is a really big deal for an Origin to kill Guardians. Guardians are basically designed to be able to quell Origins. And yeah, she ends up killing all those people, but also killing her own child. And it's
at the hands, at the threat of who other than what's his face? Shafa. Thank you. Yeah. Shafa makes his final appearance, and this is much later in life than when we see them with Demaya, right? So now we're in Cyanide's POV. And there's Shafa. He's killing her family and is like, hand me the child, let's go. Like, this is a huge mess. this time she fights back. And when we remember the first time that Schaffer hurt her, she was like, she tolerated it because there was no one else in the world that paid attention to her, and she loved him, and so she went to the fulcrum and all this and all of that. And now she had a family, she had children, and she said no to him and cursed at him, and this was like this big breakthrough moment for her to resist and essentially rebel against the Guardians and against Shafa in particular, like why it had to be him. And it was a very powerful moment, and the fact that she smothered her own child is very shocking and intense, but it just compounds the drama of that moment. Fascinating.
Yeah, she attributes it in part to what Alabaster said about not letting them get the child, and she decides that it's a fate worse than death if the kid ends up in one of those node stations. It's hard to argue with that, but it takes some serious, I don't know what to call
conviction.
It. Conviction. That's a good one. Yeah. Serious conviction to follow through by actually smothering her own child. And that scene's extremely well written, too. Like the way after, where it describes her floating in the water, and it's like her child floats too, but floats face down. Mm-hmm. Something like that. It's just absolutely a killer. Just so hard to see. And you really get these moments. Part of what makes it hit so hard, just so devastating, is that you get these moments like you were describing earlier, Charles, where Alabaster, her, and Imin are happy together and just enjoying their lives and have a kid together. And to see it end in such disaster, it just hurts.
Yeah, it hurts. And this was coming off of a chapter with Essun right before, where it's like, it's like Essun gets the band back together, I think was the name of the chapter. And it's like, there's someone that wants to see you. It's Alabaster. He's alive. And that's when I made the connection.
Well, we should...
connection at that point. And that was right before all this stuff happened. And then the book ends after all that stuff happens with an Essun chapter.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit more about... We skipped over some Essun stuff because we should at least mention that she meets up with Hoa. We find out from this... Hoa appears to be just this almost 7 or so year old child, but he's kind of weird looking. And then it's revealed that he's one of those stone eaters, which are this very mysterious humanoid, at least most of the time in how they appear, type of, I don't know what the right word is, peoples. They're certainly not people, but you know what I'm saying.
They look like a person.
Yeah, but they eat stones and apparently people sometimes. With their consent, it seems like. Like, Alabaster was kind of letting that happen. And we get Hoa actually, like, using his power to turn this beast into stone. It's a big reveal moment. And he's just following Essun around. He keeps saying that he wants Essun to like him and all of that. Still very mysterious by the end of this novel, what exactly the Stone Eaters are, what Hoa's role is, but worth mentioning. And she also runs into Tonki, who is, what was the name? Like
Binof, Binof Leadership Humaness.
Binof? Yeah, who's basically from a really high family in the society, but wasn't really able to adhere to the rules in a lot of ways. I think I would also say that she's transgender, which does not allow her to get the kind of marriage that she would need to stay up in the high society. And she's like a tinkerer now. She's really invested in learning about technologies. We also find out that she has been following Essun around. Basically since they ran into each other.
When they ran into each other back in the Fulcrum
as children.
Banouf and Binoff and Demaya. And now here they are again all these years later. And that's all these good misdirects too of why they didn't recognize, like why why Esun wouldn't have recognized them, because they changed, they re-identified, right? They're transgender, so they were described as a young girl in the Demaya chapters, and then
still a woman.
The
Tonki's considered. Yeah,
is a trans.
She's a woman.
Oh, a trans. Oh, you're right. I'm getting my characters mixed up. Yeah, she's a transgender woman, and then in the Demaya chapter, she was described as a little, like a girl, right? Like a young girl. Yeah. So that's kind of the deflection there.
Yeah, the reveals are kind of subtle around that. There's just this moment where Tonki presents as a woman and identifies as a woman, and you also have Esun seeing her change, and she just sees that she has a penis. So it's not like super explicit, like, hey, this is a transgender character.
No, but it's also a subtle way to be like, why didn't Esun recognize this person that they went through a traumatic experience with as children? As people grow up, and
I think it's they grow up, so it's but she was a girl. She presented as a girl, and now she presents as a woman. So it's not like something happened in between. But I think that it's also that Tonki looks like a total mess by that point. Like the way that she's described is like she's in ragged clothing, like she's not taking care of herself. And when they first run into her, she is kind of scary looking to them. She's like, we should probably not be getting near this person because she looks, they call it calmless, basically that she's not a part of a community. And you got to watch out for those people, especially at the start of a season.
For sure. But, so that was quite the crew as part of Esun's journey there. An interesting cast. And when everything comes to a head and Esun meets Alabaster, and we get the reveal of what happened to Alabaster. He has not been having a good time since the last Cyanide chapter to now.
No, he has not, Charles.
He's like mostly eaten and part stone.
Yes. Yeah, he's been living among the Stone Eaters, and he's definitely been partially eaten, and it's not entirely clear what his relationship with the Stone Eater that he's with is, but that Stone Eater has been eating part of it. So, we get this cool reveal that Esun is in fact Cyanide, and we get this moment this is the last moment of the book where she's meeting up with Alabaster again. He reveals that he is the one that started the season. He wants Esun to help him destroy the world. And he throws in this, have you ever heard of something called a moon? At the end. Right. Which is interesting because when that happened, when I first read it, I never thought about the fact that there weren't moons.
Right.
But is that how it hit you too, Charles?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't consider that this was a setting in which moons don't exist. That was definitely a surprise. There's these, the obelisks are these floating things in the sky, right? Isn't that what they're described as?
Yeah.
So it's like there's those and there's moons. There's a conspiracy going on, and this is definitely kicking off another adventure, right? It's into the next book. But one of the things I wanted to mention in that scene, Alabaster's like, I know what you did to our child. I understand it, but I don't forgive you, which was a heavy blow. And like, you can, what's messy about that and also so good is that you can feel for both Esun and Alabaster. It's like you can identify why that would be a devastating thing to hear as Esun, but then you also understand why Alabaster would say something like that. She did kill their kid, that is something that she did, but she was also put in a very difficult situation. So the complication of that moment and the fact that Alabaster did not let that go before inciting this incident that kicks off the next book sets a very interesting stage for book 2.
Definitely, Charles. And this isn't something that they really get into, but I doubt that Essun would ever forgive herself
for sure
for doing that too.
I mean, you see her,
and I'm
relationships
sure
that she's taken on in her journeys. You kind of start to recontextualize her relationship with Hoa and like all the other people in her life,
Tonki,
and
yeah. And if I'm looking at it from Alabaster's perspective, it's hard to blame him, like you said, Charles. And Charles, you mentioned something that I'd never really thought about before at the start of this episode, which is paralleling the idea of Essun having killed her own child and Alabaster's child as this quote-unquote mercy killing. And then at the beginning of the novel, we had the inciting incident, which is her husband doing what I would imagine he would call a mercy killing so that the child didn't have to live as a monster or whatever he would describe it as. So, because this is a guy who's never shown any violence in the past, who is widely considered to be a good person.
Cyanide would never kill a baby, especially her own. Until she does.
Right. So, in some ways, I wonder if it hits even harder for her, because sometimes the things that most bother us in other people are the things that reflect our own, for lack of a better word, flaws. And I think it's even harder for her, on top of just losing a child, which in itself is arguably the worst thing that can ever happen to a person. She also has to come face to face with the fact that this is something that she's done too.
Right. And it's interesting how like the inciting incident is something that she had committed. An action that's not totally different circumstances, but the results are the same. And it's challenging for sure. And it's the nuance in which N.K. Jemisin writes that she can do something like, kill a child, kill 2 children, and have this thing where a society lobotomizes children to use as node quelling, organic machines, basically. And it's interesting to see the choice of what is it about the fact that this inciting incident was a child that was killed, and how Essun processed that versus the actions that Cyanide had committed in her past experiences, right? This is the same person. And she didn't once be like, oh, it reminds me of when I killed my kid, back in the day, it's that detachment that you were speaking about. And how she may even be a part of this systematic violence too, although you could argue she killed her own child to protect it from a horrible life. You can kind of, at some way, see that, but it's more complicated than that. And that's the stage that N.K. Jemisin set for us at the end, this reveal of this is the same person. The same person experienced both of these things. It's very... I'm still thinking about it, I still have it. It's why this is how you sweep the Hugos. You create these complicated literary scenes and scenarios that keep you digesting it and turning it in your head and reflecting on it and theorizing on it. And there's so much meat on these bones from a thematic perspective that I still don't think I've come to a conclusion on how I feel about why there's 2 murdered children from the same character at the start and end of this book, but it's that capital L literature for sure. There's a lot to digest about it, and you can only try so hard on the show. But I don't know. What do you think?
We do our best.
We do our best.
Yeah, what I think is this is not something that has clear answers.
Yes.
N.K. Jemisin lives in the complexity and the nuance, and I'm sure she is very aware of all of these themes that are being explored, all of these different events and how they relate to each other. But I don't think she would ever say, not that I know N.K. Jemisin at all, but I do not expect that she would ever say that there are clear answers to any of these topics that we're discussing. And like you said, Charles, that's how you sweep the Hugos. You write something with this much nuance to it. And there's so much ability to discuss this. And I guess part of what I'm so impressed by in this book is the ability for it to be something that you could theoretically read as just a straightforward fantasy novel.
Sure.
And it would be an amazing story. But at the same time, the real world analogy that plays out throughout this is just brings it to another level on top of all the great characters, world building, and all of that. So it's an unbelievable book.
Well said, and it's a modern classic for sure. N.K. Jemisin skyrocketing at the time this was written, 2015, to one of the more influential modern fantasy authors for sure. And you can clearly see why. Very interesting book. It's left me with still more to think about it, and I appreciate it for that, and the amount of skill that goes into writing that, and then writing a whole character in second person and taking on themes like racism and killing babies and all this other stuff is really intense. And she handled like polyamorous relationships, transgender characters. She takes all of it on. And it's a very rewarding read. I don't know. It's something I haven't seen executed so masterfully all at once in one novel before.
Right. And I do want to give the respect to this decision to combine all of these multiple point of views. We kind of talked about it some more as, oh, did it get us? Like, what a twist, that kind of stuff. But I've never seen anything like that before or since. And it's so interesting because it takes this character and rather than these three characters that you have separate feelings about for all of them, it takes your feelings for each of them and your empathy for each of them and what they've gone through, and then just merges it into this one extremely compelling character.
For sure.
In now Essun. So if you're someone like me who really gravitated toward Tamaya, if you're someone who gravitated more towards Cyanite, whoever it was, now those people are Essun. Yeah. So whatever you felt about what they're going through, Essun went through that too. Yeah. And that's how you can make a character that you still root for even after they've killed a child, which is something
talk
that very
about
few authors can pull off.
These themes of not just oppression, but about like systematic influences you see on a person, right? Like, you think of Essun a specific way, you think of Cyanide a specific way, because they're presented differently, and the way you read them and experience them is different. And then when you realize that they are all the same person, it recontextualizes everything that you thought about all three of them, because they're one person. And that's kind of like how you take on things like racism and oppression. It's like you're seeing these things separately, and how do you rethink it in a way that you contextualize it? This is one person's shared experience. These were siloed characters that now have that shared experience that happened between them. It's like you could have all your characters be the same person, and that's interesting enough, but the fact that you not only deliver on that, but make it earned, and then also have it compound the themes of your story all at once, that's art. That is masterwork. And that was realizing all these characters. It made me go back and think about how I perceived the character, which is what she's trying to do to like challenge racism and challenge oppression. It's like, go back and think about how you perceived a certain person, or maybe a certain kind of person, or a certain group of people, and recontextualize it now that you have the whole story. It's brilliant. I don't know. What more do you want me to say about it? It's brilliant.
Yeah, well said, Charles. I was going to say, I don't know how I'm supposed to add anything to that. I 100% agree, and absolutely brilliant work by N.K. Jemisin here. And so pumped that we got to really dive into this. I mean, we're about hour 15 or so into this. We could probably go on way, way longer discussing all the different themes and interesting plot points, great characters. We could go on forever probably talking about that, and maybe we'll get back to discussing stuff from this.
The good news is there's two more books.
There's 2 more books. Yes. So, and for now, I think it's probably time to call. We're already kind of over our typical episode length here.
Well said, Dylan. I don't know about you, but I'm just about ready for that sweet, sweet outro music.
Get that sweet, sweet outro music pumping, Charles.
All right. Thank you all for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. If you like what you heard today, guys, check us out over on social media. Let us know what you thought. We're on there all the time, talking to people, replying to stuff, sharing things. And that's on Twitter at the FTF Podcast with the number 1 on the end, and on Instagram at the FTF Podcast. And Dylan, if they like what they heard today and they're engaging with us on social media and they want to support the show even more, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast. Now there is the option to do that on Spotify. That's relatively new. Mm-hmm. And over half of our listenership, you're over there on Spotify, and it's so easy to just click right at the top of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast page. You'll see the star icon. Just click that. If you throw us 5 stars, we would be extremely grateful. It helps us out so much as a show. But just listening is more than enough. We really appreciate you
listening. I couldn't agree more, Dylan. Just by listening, you guys are awesome, making it all the way to the end. Thank you all so much for listening to us talk about this book and all the other books we talked about. We greatly appreciate your listening and your support. And as always, guys, go forth and conquer, friends.